Just
there we go. But just Rachel will be recorded, don't worry.
I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And I think, Matt, you're going to spotlight me, is that right? Great. Brilliant, thank you. Great, well, this is a big subject tonight, and I'm aware I'm talking to people who probably know a lot more than I do about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but it's been a real joy to be reading about him and reading some of his work over the last couple of months. Also, welcome everybody. I know there's people who've come from a bit further afield than Cambridge, so thank you for your interest and your support. I hope it will be helpful. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is very quotable, and just here on this first screen, I don't know if you can see it, I'm just moving my other screen a little bit out of the way. There's a quote. There's so many things I wanted to put down on this PowerPoint, just some quotes to give you a flavour of his life and his writing, his theology. But I just thought it might be helpful to start with this one, just thinking about why he's worth studying for us today. Here's a picture of him with some confirmation candidates, by the way, just on the left here, and we've got a few other photos as well. But this quote just gives you a little bit of the flavour. He was quite a provocative person, but it gives you a flavour of what he was observing through this time in Germany. Oh, that should be 1945, 1906 to 1945. Those were his dates. This is what he said. This was written towards the end of his life in a work that you can read about in a work called Letters and Prayers from Prison. He wrote, "Upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of a political or a religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. Under the overwhelming impact of rising power, humans are deprived of their inner independence and more or less consciously give up establishing an autonomous position toward the emerging circumstances. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil." Now that's quite an erudite statement, isn't it? But hopefully you'll see something of that as we go through his life. Don't worry if you didn't kind of get all of that. But let me just give you some reasons why I think it's worth us still studying Dietrich Bonhoeffer today, reading his work and finding out about his life. I mean, you might think, well, he died over 70 years ago. He lived in Germany and in a very different period of history than our own. So why bother finding out about him? Well, let me just give you a few reasons up front before we dive into his life. Well, first of all, he was a Christian brother who was faithful to the end of his life. I think a very inspiring man. And his life was as exciting as his theology. He was both a pastor and an academic. So he's written some great sermons, as well as books, letters, poetry, plays, and prose. And his work is greatly studied today by all kinds of people, not just theologians or academics. He was also a very cultured man. He was a great musician, and he loved the arts. He could have been a musician. He could have made that his profession. He enjoyed life and he travelled a great deal. He mixed with all kinds of interesting people. He was at ease talking theology with Jews, Catholics, and other faiths, other denominations, and he could relate to all kinds of people. I think just on a side note too, he somebody who knew love. He was engaged just a few months before he was imprisoned. He sadly didn't get to be married, but there's that sort of going on in the background as well that I think is interesting. But most of all, he's interesting because he lived through turbulent political times in world history and in the history of the church, and also in a world where secularism was running rife, a post-Christian world in the wake of the Great War, World War I, and throughout the events running up to and including World War II. He writes in that context, not capitulating ground to secularism, but neither does he lob hand grenades. He's not aggressive in that sense. He thinks theologically about it, and he has much to teach us about discipleship in a church that felt quite weak. How to live out a faith and commitment to Christ in day-to-day life. And of course, we know that his faith in the end cost him his life as he was executed by the Nazi regime at the end of the war. He is honoured in his own country and in many others, and including ours. And he is just a picture You may know that there's a statue, there's a sculpture to him. He's the fourth one along, and these are martyrs who are honoured in Westminster Abbey, and he's there amongst others like Martin Luther King Jr. So he's honoured in this country as well. And I've been really blessed by reading quite a few of his works and a biography. I just want to tell you some of the books that I've read, so you know, maybe that gives you an idea. We'll look at a few of them as well. So there's The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together, which I'll come back to later, and then The Letters and Papers from Prison. And I also read a biography about him by Eric Metaxas, who's an American but with German descent as well, and that was a really good read. So those are some of the texts that I've used. There's loads on the internet too, some great talks and podcasts, all sorts of stuff. So just tonight, just as we begin, I hope just to give us a bit of an overview of his life. I've hopefully given you some reasons to want to listen to this talk and think why it might be helpful to us. But I want to really just give an overview of some of the things that he had to wrestle with as a Christian, especially living under a tyrannical regime, difficult times to be a Christian that he lived. But also, if you're completely new to him and you know nothing about him, that's fine. I hope it will be accessible. But similarly, if you've done quite a lot of reading and perhaps you know more about him, there'll be some things I know that people will probably have questions about. There'll be some things to do with his ethics and how he interpreted the Bible that may leave us sort of questioning and wondering, why did he do that, or why did he say that? And it may be just at the end you might want to chip in some reflections. I don't have the answers at all, I'm sure, but there might be others who want to say something about that. So as Matt said, we're going to have this evening, this sort of next sort of 50 minutes or so is going to be in two parts, and it'll be broken up with a little bit of breakout time. If you want to join a group, you don't have to, and then we'll wrap up by 8:30 at the end, just so you know. So just in this first part, I want to cover sort of the early part of his life through to about 1938 or so. So he was born in 1906, February 4th, 1906, in a place called Breslau. Now, Breslau was part of the old Germany under the Kaiser. I don't know how good your history of Germany is, but the boundaries changed quite a lot in the last century. And Breslau now is in Poland. But in 1912, he moved with his family to Berlin. His father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was an eminent psychiatrist and neurologist. He was a big name in his field. And he was, just perhaps interesting, he was a noted critic of Sigmund Freud, who will be a name to us too. Bonhoeffer's mother, Paula, was from an aristocratic family, and there were mayors and parsons and well-known academics and professors in her background. Dietrich was one of 8 children. He had a big family, and he had a twin sister called Sabina, who he was particularly close to. But the whole family was close. And one of his brothers, Walter, was killed in World War I. He died of his wounds, sadly, and that was a terrible shock and tragedy for the family, of course. His mother, I think, pretty much took to her bed for a whole year. But Walter passed on his Bible to Dietrich. So Dietrich, I think, was only about sort of 8 at the time. He was still a young boy, and he ended up with his Bible. And it affected Dietrich greatly too. And he certainly was a pacifist for most of his life. Now, Paula homeschooled all the children for the first part of their lives, and she was a Christian, and she took great care to read the Bible and pray with them. Though they never, strangely, they never really got involved in church, which I found quite odd. But they were all baptized. They were a very musical family, and they would sing hymns together at home. Now, the father was supportive, but he seemed to be more agnostic. He would later think it was a bit odd when Dietrich announced at the age of 14 that he wanted to be a theologian. He couldn't quite see why that would be a good thing to do. But having said that, he always remained supportive and proud of his son. Now, the Bonhoeffers' children grew up in an intellectual and cosmopolitan world in the Grunewald district of Berlin, playing with others who were from a similar background. There were lots of academics who lived around there, and their families all mixed in and out of each other's houses. So Dietrich had announced at the age of 14 he wanted to be a theologian. And so he did go off to university when he was, I think, about 17. And he first studied in the university town of Tübingen, which is a top university. But in Germany at that time, you wouldn't just stay in one place. You perhaps do 1 year here and then move on to somewhere else. So he came back to Berlin in 1924, where he continued his studies. And in 1927, he got his licentiate, which is his PhD. So he was just 21 when he got his PhD. He was a bright cookie. And he was ordained a pastor in the German Lutheran Church. But because he was so young, he felt he was a bit too young to take on responsibility for a pastorate. And he was also quite keen to see the world. He was a great traveller. He wanted to be a traveller. He was interested in other cultures and languages. So from 1928 to 29, he was an assistant pastor for a German-speaking congregation in Barcelona, in Spain. And he loved it, and he particularly got invested in the youth work there. Before long, he was taking over all sorts of ministries and sort of really shaking the church up. So it's quite sad, I think, for the pastor when he returned back to Germany in 1929. He came back because in order to be a university lecturer, he had to do another thesis, another PhD effectively. And so he did that. It was called Act und Sein, Act and Being. Where the last PhD had focused on the church, this one was more about revelation, the doctrine of revelation. And he engaged with a famous theologian at that time called Karl Barth. Some of you may have heard of him. He was very much influenced by him. I've got just another picture here. I've got the odd picture. Sorry, there's not as many as I would have liked. It's a bit hard to source. But here's a picture of his study, his room in the family home, where he lived a great deal of his life. As he was still quite young and wanting some more experiences of church and theology and so on, he went to the States, and he studied at a place called Union Theological Seminary in New York. He was doing a postdoc fellowship this time. That's what took him there. So he had a year studying Union Theological Seminary. And he was quite disappointed with the quality of the theological study there. But the biggest impact this year or so had on him was that he got involved with a Black Abyssinian Baptist church in Harlem, quite different from his experience of church or life really when he went there. But he was really struck by, he was impressed by the teaching, the community life and the music. He saw that these Christians knew how to live the Christian life. And again, he got involved with youth and children's work there. And when he returned back to Germany, he brought back lots of records of Black gospel music, and that he later used when he set up his own seminary. He thought that was really helpful, so he used that again. Now, when he returned to Germany, he was wrestling. In a sense, he was all fully equipped as an academic by now. He'd done the things, he jumped through the hoops, but he was wrestling between academia and being a pastor. He'd learned a lot about different experiences of pastoring too. But he returned to Berlin, and between 1931 and 1936, he taught at the University of Berlin on and off during that time. Now, just going back to history a bit more and what was going on in Germany through the 30s, if you might remember, maybe you've read about or learnt at school, at that time, there was the rise of National Socialism and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. In 1933, got a picture here, we all know what Hitler looks like, but here's a picture of Hitler. In 1933, Hitler was made Reichskanzler. He was the Führer, the country's leader. And he filled a political void. If you remember, after the World War I, Treaty of Versailles, there were many stringent measures, devastating measures that were imposed on the country at that time. And there was great depression. And so in a sense, I guess there was a political void which Hitler filled. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was really quite prophetic of the dangers that the Führer figure represented. Even before Hitler became Chancellor, Dietrich had done a radio broadcast pointing this out. Now, interestingly, it was cut short, it was edited out, he was cut off as they realised he was saying some pretty inflammatory things. So he was pretty brave already in the early 30s about speaking up against this regime, and that only continued. And I think it's quite interesting. His family was quite extraordinary in all sorts of ways, and he had a couple of grannies who I think were pretty amazing. One of them, at 90, barged past a whole bunch of stormtroopers who would have been fully armed and quite scary. She wanted to do her shopping where she always did her shopping. She said, "I'll do my shopping where I always do it." And of course, it was a Jewish shop. By now, many of the shops were sort of marked as, you weren't allowed to buy from the Jews. You can see here a picture, and that was all restricted. And that was all part of the campaign for discrimination against the Jews. But anyway, his granny at 90, she just barged through that and did her shopping, which I quite like. Dietrich often spoke up against the persecution of the Jewish people and the hypocrisy of the so-called Christians in the country. And this is one of the things he said. I say he's very quotable. He said, "Only he who shouts for the Jews can sing the Gregorian chants." Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't always get it right. Interesting, a number of his relations had married ethnic Jews who'd become Christians. And when a father-in-law of one of his sisters, remember he had quite a big family, one of his sisters had married a Jewish man. And when this man's father died, he was asked to take the funeral. Now, he was warned by friends that this man was of Jewish descent, and therefore it would put him in grave danger. And so at the time, he refused. And this was a great moment of regret for him, and something that no doubt haunted him for some of his life. We know that later on, he was involved in rescuing Jews, most famously in something called Operation 7, where 14 Jews were smuggled out of Germany through his efforts. And he would also later help another sister, his twin, Sabina, and her ethnically Jewish Christian husband for them to escape to England. When things got really quite dangerous and dodgy, they eventually left and came to England. So you can imagine that in the 1930s, the church in Germany was in disarray and struggling. Like so much of the country, the church wanted to believe that Hitler was okay and really provided strong leadership. But divisions were bubbling up, and those who were critical of the passive Lutheran church started thinking about a new denomination. They wanted to distance themselves from those Christians who didn't seem to be standing up for what was right. And I'm going to really simplify this terribly because I know it's complex. People who stayed within the church didn't necessarily do wrong, but it was one of those situations where people had to make a decision either to stay or to jump, to go to something new. Now, there's been lots of parallels in history with this sort of situation arising, because every denomination has its faults, and there'll be times when people feel they need to leave. So this would just be an example of that. Now, at this time, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was becoming quite sort of notorious, and he felt he just needed a bit of distance from Germany. And he was also quite keen to strengthen his ecumenical connections. And so he decided to accept a pastorate in England, again, to pastor German-speaking congregations, a bit like he'd done in Spain. And by now, also, you can imagine in the 30s, there were some refugees, some Christian Jews who had come across to England, who'd started to flee. And by now the persecution of the Jews was growing. There were ghettos being formed along all sorts of discrimination, like this shop incidents, but people losing their jobs, their status being barred from all sorts of jobs. So in 1933 to 1935, he pastored churches in Whitechapel and in Sydenham in London. And this time he helped helped him to become one of the most important interpreters of German events for the ecumenical church in the West. He made a friend of Bishop Bell, Bishop of Chichester. I think I've got a picture of him. Here we are. Yeah, Bishop George Bell. Some of you may have heard of him. And this bishop became a good friend of Dietrich's, and he made great efforts to bring the plight of the resistance in Germany, those who wanted to oust Hitler. He wanted to bring them to the attention of the British government in subsequent years, but unfortunately that wasn't very effective. Government wasn't particularly interested. But George Bell always remained a good friend to Dietrich through his life. Now, it was also during this time that Dietrich planned to visit Gandhi in India and spend some time with him. He was fascinated by his teaching and his way of life, and he thought it would be helpful to go and spend some time just learning about that. And he had another granny, I mentioned his grannies, his other granny was keen to sponsor him. So you can see how serious he was about understanding other faiths and about learning to live in community and care for his fellow man. And also, just incidentally, earlier on, he'd done various trips to Rome too. Again, he was interested in Roman Catholicism and what he could learn from there. So, he was definitely a man, an ecumenical sort of a man. But he couldn't stay away from Germany forever, and things were hotting up there. So by now, something called the Confessing Church had been established. This was the new denomination that broken away from the traditional Lutheran Church, the Confessing Church. And of course, they needed resources to train pastors. They needed seminaries to train up new church workers. And Dietrich seemed to be the perfect man for the job because he had seen what had been happening in other countries, which was very different from the German model. If you were training to be a pastor in Germany, you went to just a traditional university. You'd go to lectures, you'd write your essays, do your exams, and then you'd be given a pastorate. Whereas he could see that there was real value in living in community and just practicing what it looked like to live alongside your brothers and sisters in Christ in that learning time. So he set up something called Finkenwald. Here's a picture of the sort of environment in which Finkenwald was based. It started up, this seminary, with about 20 students, and it was quite an intense place. He taught students to publicly confess their sins to each other. He laid down various rules. One of them was that no student should talk about another student unless they were present. And all of life was lived together in this lovely countryside, away from distractions. And there was good fun too. He would lead music. They did, listen to their gospel songs, and there would be cricket. There would be swimming in the lake, and it was a bit just quite basic, really, but really living life together. And during this time, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote various tracts. He did quite a bit of writing. He wrote against compromise in the church struggle, but he also wrote two of his most famous works too, which we're going to look at a few excerpts from in just a moment before we take a break. He wrote two books there called one of them was The Cost of Discipleship in 1937, and the other is Life Together in 1938. And I just want to give you a flavour of those two books. So first, The Cost of Discipleship, which in the German was just called Nachfolge, which just means discipleship. And this book was made popular by Bishop Bell, the guy we just mentioned, at the end of the war, when Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been martyred. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer just wanted to simply talk about every Christian's discipleship, whatever their path in life, whatever their suffering. And his main focus in discipleship was helping us understand the true meaning of grace, how grace couldn't be cheapened in our lives of discipleship. So he begins the book by contrasting cheap grace with costly grace, and understanding it was most needed by a church needing to stand firm against the oppressive Nazi forces and not compromise. And then the heart of that book that then follows this section is an exposition of the Sermon on the Mount, which has been a great read for me alongside our Sunday series. I'm just going to give you now just a little bit of a flavour of the cost of discipleship. So I've just got two slides now. I don't know if you can read those, but I'll just read out a few excerpts from this book, Discipleship. So cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. Every moment and every situation challenges us to action and to obedience. We have literally no time to sit down and ask ourselves whether so-and-so is our neighbour or not. We must get into action and obey. We must behave like a neighbour to him. And here's just a few more bits from the book. There's so many things I could have put here, but here are a few more. Judging others makes us blind, whereas love is illuminating. By judging others, we blind ourselves to our own evil and to the grace which others are just as entitled to as we are. Fruit is always miraculous, the created. It is never the result of willing, but always a growth. The fruit of the Spirit is a gift of God, and only He can produce it. They who bear it know as little about it as the tree knows of its fruit. They know only the power of Him on whom their life depends. And then finally, and probably famously, many of you will have heard this, when Christ calls a man, He bids him come and die, which is very much like what Jesus teaches us, doesn't he, in Mark 8 and so on. Okay, so that's a little flavour of discipleship. And just before we come to a break, I'm just going to give you a few excerpts from Life Together as well, which is the other book that he wrote while he was at Finkenwald. Okay. Let me just tell you that this came out shortly. This book came out shortly. Let me see. Yes, just after Finkenwald was closed by the Gestapo, because they caught wind of what was going on and they wanted to close it down because, of course, the confessing church was seen as rebellious and not sort of under their control, like the Lutheran church was at that time. And this book was very much a reflection on the pattern of life at the seminary. And it was written in a dark time in the life of the confessing church. In 1938, when Hitler celebrated his 50th birthday, he demanded an oath of allegiance from all church ministers. And sadly, the vast majority capitulated and signed. So that's the context into which this book was written. I'll perhaps just leave you to read those quotes here yourself and give my voice a little bit of a break. But I think it's just quite interesting to see what he says about community, the dangers and the blessings. I think we can see the blessing of just being able to be open and real with one another about our sin and our struggles. That really comes through, I think, in that second quote. And then I've just got one more slide here for us to look at, which again I think is very convicting. He says, if my sinfulness appears to me in any small way smaller or less detestable in comparison with the sins of others, I'm still not recognizing my sinfulness at all. I can no longer condemn or hate a brother for whom I pray, no matter how much trouble he causes me. So I think some really challenging things in this book. And the beauty about this book, if you're minded to read it, is quite short. It's very deep, but it is quite short, so it's very readable. I can commend that. Okay. Great. We're coming up to the end of the first section, but let me just tell you now that by now, in 1938, Hitler and his ministers were imposing restrictions on teaching. So they said in the church that the Old Testament, remember the anti-Semitism, the Old Testament was being outlawed, as was also much of Paul's teaching. Anything that spoke favourably of the Jews, Hitler didn't want being preached on in churches. And persecution was ramping up for the Jews. And in March 1938, Hitler started to implement his grand designs of taking over much of the world. And it started with the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, and then the Sudetenland in what was then Czechoslovakia. And that would eventually lead to World War II in 1939, as we know. So we're going to break there for a moment. I've got a couple of questions that I thought maybe we could just think about, having taken us through the early part of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, mainly his sort of formation and stuff about the church. There's a couple of questions I thought we could have a look at in breakout groups for about sort of 5 or 6 minutes. I think that's what we'll do, Matt, about 6 minutes. If you could just perhaps take a photo or do a screen grab of these. You don't have to discuss these questions. It's really just a guide to get us thinking back over his life, and perhaps thinking about how God worked in his life, the different experiences that he brought him through for what was coming up. And then just thinking about what would it have been like to have lived as a Christian during this time in Germany with the rise of the Nazis. What would have been the pressures, but perhaps also what would have been the opportunities. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Have you all had a time just to look at those questions? And then I'm going to ask Matt to put us in. Let me just find the right place to come to in the slides. Okay. Great. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that just gave you a bit of a breather and just a rest from my voice for a little bit. We've got part 2 now, which is slightly shorter than the first part. So will probably be about 10 minutes of me talking now before another little break. We're now going to look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life from 1938 to his death in 1945. And we're just going to stop off again and briefly look at 2 other works that he wrote. One called Ethics, just simply called Ethics, and another which is Letters and Papers from Prison, which of course he never knew was going to be a book, because these were simply letters that he wrote and then were smuggled out. But I'll tell you a bit more about those in a moment. So now Dietrich Bonhoeffer would turn more from a prophet, somebody who'd spoken into a certain situation to say what he thought was going to happen, to a spy. So quite something that he probably never anticipated before. By now, Germany was headed for war, and having helped various people escape from Germany, Bonhoeffer also took some time to get away again. He returned to New York, where he was much sought after academically. And given that things were hotting up, people thought it was wise that he got out of the country for a little while. But once he got there, within weeks of being there, just after 3 weeks, he realized that he was in the wrong place. He shouldn't be in New York. He knew that in New York he was replaceable, whereas in Germany he could be useful to God in unique ways. And he also felt that he would have no right to help the German church rebuild itself after the war if he was not on the ground during it. So he took one of the last ships sailing back to Germany before the outbreak of the war. And so here's a picture of him in 1939 back in Germany. Incidentally, he liked his tobacco, so that's not an unusual photo of him with a cigarette there. Now we have to remember that Bonhoeffer had been inclined towards pacifism. He absolutely dreaded conscription, having to join the army, though he didn't condemn anyone who did. So many of his students at the seminary ended up having to join up because that's what people had to do. And people had no choice. But amazingly, God provided for Bonhoeffer that he could avoid conscription because of the ground that he'd already laid in his life. Ironically, it was through Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, a man called Hans von Dohnanyi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Hans von Dohnanyi, who was a senior lawyer and a government advisor with access to the Ministry of Justice Intelligence. Bonhoeffer managed to avoid conscription. Because of all of his travel, his knowledge of languages and his ecumenical links, he got a job with the military intelligence known as the Abwehr as a civilian. So effectively, he became a double agent for the rest of the war period, which just seems so ironic, but that's God, isn't it? So he now saw pacifism as an illegitimate escape for him, especially as his contacts with responsible political and military leaders of the resistance grew. He could see a role working with the resistance. So here he was, banned from Berlin, banned from teaching and writing, and considered a danger to the state. But somehow he was able to do good from the inside with incredible freedom. And at the same time as being on business for the government, he managed to visit pastors in the confessing church, and he managed to write his next work, this work called Ethics, which was unfinished and finally appeared posthumously in 1949. Now, ethics focused on actions and duty and responsibilities of Christians living in a fallen world. And I'm going to just give you again a little flavour of some of the material there, some of the quotes. It just shows something of the things he was wrestling with. He said, those who wish even to focus on the problem of a Christian ethic are faced with an outrageous demand. From the very outset, they must give up, as inappropriate to this topic, the very two questions that led them to deal with the ethical problem. How can I be good, and how can I do something good? Instead, they must ask the wholly other, completely different question, what is the will of God? I don't know if you can quite get your head around that, but he's clearly wrestling with what does it look like to do good and what does it look like to do the will of God? And then he says this, he says, what is worse than doing evil is being evil. It is worse for a liar to tell the truth than for a lover of truth to lie. I wonder if you can see the distinction there that he's writing about. Well, that gives us a flavour of this book and shows something of what Bonhoeffer would be wrestling with himself as he began working for the resistance undercover and ultimately plots to assassinate Hitler. So these were grave things that were being planned. And we don't find any easy answers or justification for his decisions. Undoubtedly, if he'd had a chance to finish this work himself properly, there may have been some more developed thinking there, but he never got the chance. Now, just going back to Germany and Hitler again, there would be several assassination attempts on Hitler's life. And these are ones that are sort of known about in 1943 and 1944, especially. In April 1943, Hans von Danyani, that's his brother-in-law, if you remember, who was high up in military intelligence, he was arrested a few weeks after this first assassination attempt in April 1943. And Bonhoeffer's arrest shortly after this was mainly focused on evidence that was found about money laundering to help some Jews escape from Germany. Now, Bonhoeffer, this is again is quite an interesting little story around the events of Bonhoeffer's arrest. He had a tip-off that the Gestapo were coming for him. And so he managed to squirrel away any really incriminating evidence that was in his house. He managed to hide it in rafters and so on. And he left out unimportant and distracting documentation on the tables to be found. He then went next door to his sister. Remember, they were living in a kind of a bit of a community in this area with his family being neighbours and things. So he went next door to his sisters and had a final decent meal before they came and took him to prison. He took him to a prison called Tegel, which was a military prison in Berlin, but he clearly got his last good meal in. Now, he spent 18 months in this particular prison. He was kept in a cell which was 9 foot by 3 foot. You imagine that, it's pretty small. It was tiny with a narrow bed and not very comfortable or inspiring existence. And yet this is where he wrote some of his most exciting theology. And most of it was smuggled out in letters that I mentioned at the beginning. That's available to us in a book called Letters and Papers from Prison. Now, at first, he found it pretty humiliating to be in this situation, to be in these confines. But he always conducted himself in public with restraint and dignity. Other prisoners looked up to him. Prison warders and medical orderlies treated him well. And on account of that, he was able to write a lot of letters to his family, his fiancée, whom he'd only got engaged to 3 months before being arrested, and his best friend, Eberhard Bettger. Now, by the way, Eberhard Bettger's written a biography of his, and he's probably the one who knew Bonhoeffer best. So if you can read anything by him. He sometimes had to write in code and on tiny scraps of paper, but we have a good deal preserved to this day, apart from the last few months in this prison. They were destroyed. In his correspondence, you can see how concerned he was for others. He was at pains, first of all, to reassure his family that he was well, that he was able to use the time profitably, and that he felt close to God. And you can see during this time, there was real hope that he expected to be released from prison. He kept talking about what would happen in a few months' time. There were people getting married, there were children being born and baptized and things like that. And he hoped to be there and share in all of that. But by now, and of course, by now, the Allies, we know our history of World War II, they were making good progress. And actually, he was more at threat of dying or being taken out by an Allied bomb landing on the prison, because Berlin was already starting to be bombed at this point. But fortunately, that didn't happen, although the prisoners, he describes many fearful occasions where he had to pastor the other prisoners and sort of help them deal with that frightening experience. He wrote a poem, which you can read in the letters from prison, called Who Am I? And I just want to share a little bit of that poem, because I think it shows, despite all this outward strength and his wonderful character and dignity, there was frailty and there were fears there as well. So let me just put a few verses. This is a slightly longer poem, but I've just taken bits which I think give you a bit of an insight into what he was wrestling with. It's called Who Am I? Who am I? They often tell me I step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Am I then really that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I myself know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath, as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colours, for flowers, for the voices of birds? Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others, and before myself a contemptible woebegone weakling? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Who I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. Again, it gives you a bit of an insight into what he was going through and how he was trying to trust God through all these things and have that security. Now, on July the 20th, 1944, a bit back to history here again, there was a significant attempt made on Hitler's life at the Wolf's Lair. You may have seen, I think there's been a film made about that. It was also called the von Stauffenberg plot, as it was led by a man called Klaus von Stauffenberg. Now, a bomb exploded there, but it didn't kill Hitler. He was saved, apparently, by a very large, solid wooden table that took the full force and sort of broke down the impact of the blast. Arrests were made and men tortured, and evidence, therefore, was given. This was a huge blow to Bonhoeffer, who, of course, was in prison at this time, but knew he was aware of this attempt being made. And then a few months later, in September of 1944, a whole cache of papers called the Zossen papers were discovered. Now, these papers contained a detailed account of some of the war atrocities and treatment of the Jews during the Nazi regime. They'd been collected and stashed away safely so that they could be used against the regime in due course, and those guilty could be held to account. Now, these papers sadly really incriminated Bonhoeffer, and he knew now that his life was very much in danger once those had been found. And so in October 1944, Bonhoeffer was moved from Tegel prison to a Gestapo prison in Berlin, and he spent a further 6 months there. Now, in February 1945, 6 months on from then, he was suddenly moved. The Reich's days were clearly numbered by this point. The Allies were closing in, and Hitler must have known the end of the war was coming. But he wanted to make sure that the dissidents who'd betrayed him, I guess, as he saw, were punished, and it was clear that Bonhoeffer was on that list. So Bonhoeffer was taken first to Buchenwald concentration camp, and then finally on to Flossenburg, which is where many of the executions happened. Now, the last weeks of his life were spent with prisoners from all over Europe, which I think is just an amazing thing of God, actually, as well, that he should be together with various different people like that, which he would have loved. I would have appreciated, I'm not sure loved at that point, because he would have realised what was coming. But one of those prisoners was an English officer, and he was called Payne Best. Bonhoeffer asked Best to relay a message to, do you remember Bishop Bell, his friend in England? Should Payne Best make it home, he wanted him to pass something on, which he did. But these, just interestingly, I just want to read a comment from Best's reflections on Bonhoeffer. He himself wrote a book because he survived the war. He got back to England and he wrote a book himself. And in that book, he reflects on the character of Bonhoeffer. And this is what he writes. He was all humility and sweetness. He always seemed to me to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy in every smallest event in life, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. He was one of the very few men that I have ever met to whom his God was real and close to him. That's a lovely testimony, isn't it, of the life of somebody who would have been aware that he was going to be martyred soon. And also this other message, so the message that Bess passed on to Bishop Bell as Bonhoeffer was taken from the other prisoners to Flossenburg. This is what Bonhoeffer said, these last words that Payne Best heard. This is the end, for me, the beginning of life. This is the end, for me, the beginning of life. The day before his death, on the 8th of April, so before the 9th when he was actually executed, he'd been persuaded to take a little service by the other prisoners. And Best again said that he found just the right words to express the spirit of their imprisonment and the thoughts and resolutions which it had brought, and it had reached the hearts of all. At Flossenburg, Bonhoeffer was tried by a court that met in the laundry room. He was found guilty, stripped naked, and hanged on the gallows. And I've just got one more picture to show you. This is the memorial plaque that's at Flossenburg. And you can see there's a translation there as well, that this is for all the martyrs, because he was one of a few there, that were a number who were executed. And you can see they gave their lives for freedom, justice, and human dignity. And this was just 3 weeks before Hitler took his own life, just before the end of the war. And Bonhoeffer's parents sadly only found out about their son's fate in July, so a good few months later. And that was on the radio, sadly. It was very hard to get information about people who died in concentration camps, especially Germans, I guess. So in conclusion, we're come to the end. You've all done very well. I'm going to finish in just a moment. I think as we look back on his life, we can see that his theology, his life reflected his theology, and his theology reflected his life. Jesus Christ was at the centre of his life, and it seems to me that he understood what Paul meant by to live is Christ, to die is gain. And Bonhoeffer continues to challenge us, doesn't he, how we live out our faith moment by moment, being both churchmen and women, and also citizens living in this world, a world that belongs to Christ, but where Christendom is no longer the backbone of our country and world. And we may not agree with everything that Bonhoeffer wrote or how he lived his life, but I think it's clear that his testimony continues to challenge us and speak to us from beyond the grave, doesn't it? So I'm going to just finish there. I'm just looking at the time. We've just got a few minutes. I wonder, there were just a couple of questions I wanted us maybe just to consider. So the first question, how do we see both God's providence and Bonhoeffer's obedience to his faith influencing the course of his life? So looking at God's work in his life, but also how Bonhoeffer took responsibility for his actions, how he lived his life, how he was obedient to his faith. And then I think, again, I just couldn't resist putting another quote in, because I think this is something, again, he's quite famous for. He said, "We're not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke in the wheel itself." How do we see that played out in his life? What ethical questions does it raise for us? It's not simple, is it? I think we can see, but that's quite a provocative statement. Now, I'm just looking at the time. I don't think we particularly got time to go into groups again. I'm sorry about that. As ever, there's too much to say. But maybe just have a little mull on that by yourselves, those two questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and maybe we'll just have a few minutes of people, if they want to make any reflections or ask any questions. I'm not promising answers, but if you want to share anything, we'll just ask anything. We can have a go at thinking about that together. Is that all right? Stop.